Picture the scene. 1,000 sunburnt backs bent under a single block of limestone. A whip cracks somewhere off frame. A man in a striped headdress points imperiously at a half-built pyramid, while his slaves drop dead in the sand around him. You've seen this image your whole life. You've seen it in the Ten Commandments. You've seen it in cartoons and textbooks and video games. You've heard it in the way people sigh, "I feel like I'm building the pyramids," when their boss piles on the work. It is one of the most durable pictures we have of the entire ancient world. Whip, sand, suffering, stone. And it's wrong. Well, actually, it's a little more nuanced wrong. Wrong at the foundation. The people who built the Great Pyramid were not slaves. And we can now say that with the kind of evidence that comes with names, with payslips, with skeletons, and with a 4,500-year-old diary written by the actual foreman. So I'm not here to ruin the pyramids for you. I'm here to do the opposite. Because once you see who really built them, the Great Pyramid stops being a monument to cruelty and becomes something far weirder and honestly far more impressive. Let's dig. Here's the version almost everyone carries around. And I want to be genuinely fair to it, because it makes total sense. If you believe it, you are not being lazy. You were handed a very good story. The logic runs like this. The pyramids are impossibly big. The Great Pyramid is something like 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, stacked with terrifying precision into a structure that stayed the tallest building on Earth for thousands of years. And here's the second brain wrinkle, before we've even left the introduction. The Great Pyramid stayed the tallest man-made structure on the entire planet for more than 3,800 years, until Lincoln Cathedral in England finally overtook it around the year 1311. 3,800 years at number one. No human structure has ever held that title for anywhere near as long before or since. So when you stand in front of something that vast, your brain reaches for the only explanation that feels emotionally correct. Nobody would do this voluntarily. Somebody must have been forced, somebody must have suffered, and surely a god king with absolute power had the one resource that makes monstrous projects possible. Bodies he owned outright. And then there's the Bible. The book of Exodus tells the story of the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, groaning under forced labor, making bricks without straw. For centuries, people quietly stitched that story onto the pyramids. Even though Exodus never actually says the Israelites built them, it doesn't. Go and check. The mental image just fused on its own, and it has never come apart since. So you've got scale, you've got a god king, and you've got a sacred text humming in the background. 3 ingredients, one irresistible picture, and it got reinforced at every turn. In 1956, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments put it on the biggest screen in the world. Thousands of extras, cracking whips, men collapsing in the dust. That film alone shaped how an entire generation pictured ancient Egypt. By the time you sat down in a classroom, the slavery image wasn't a theory you were weighing. It was just wallpaper, the background assumption of the whole civilization. And there's one more reason it sticks, a quieter one. We genuinely struggle to imagine that people would choose to do something this hard. We look at the precision, blocks fitted so tightly you can't slide a knife blade between them, a structure aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that embarrasses some modern buildings, and the modern brain just refuses. Surely nobody volunteers for that. Surely somebody's standing behind them with a whip. That instinct feels like common sense. It's also, as we're about to see, completely backwards. So the trouble is, the picture has a source? One man, really, is responsible for putting the word slaves into the story in the first place. And the moment you look at who he was and when he lived, the whole thing starts to wobble. The man who really kicked this whole thing off was a Greek tourist named Herodotus. Around 450 BCE, Herodotus visited Egypt and wrote that 100,000 men toiled in shifts to raise the Great Pyramid. It's a vivid number, it's a quotable number, and it stuck for 2,500 years. Here's the crack. Herodotus was writing about 2,000 years after the pyramid was actually built. Let me make that gap physical for a second, because the size of it is the whole point. The distance in time between Herodotus and the construction of the Great Pyramid is larger than the distance between you and Jesus Christ. Larger. He was not a reporter on the scene. He was a man arriving 20 centuries late, scribbling down temple gossip from priests whose accounts mixed real history with national mythology, a bit like asking a tour guide today to give you the unvarnished truth about the founding of Rome. Entertaining, not a primary source. And modern archaeology has quietly dismantled even his headline figure. Egypt's archaeologists now estimate the actual workforce at around 10,000 people at a time, roughly a tenth of what Herodotus claimed. He didn't just get the vibe wrong, he overcounted the labor force by a factor of 10. And Herodotus wasn't even the only one layering this on. The idea that Israelite slaves specifically built the pyramids is traceable to the Jewish historian Josephus, writing around 94 CE, who flatly stated that the Egyptians set the Hebrews to building pyramids. And his works were hugely influential on later European readers. The Bible itself, again, never makes that claim. So, slaves built the pyramids isn't one ancient fact. It's a snowball in a Greek tourist's exaggeration, a later historian welding on the Hebrews, the whole thing fused with a scriptural story it doesn't actually appear in, and finally lit up in Technicolor by Hollywood. Every layer added centuries or millennia after the stone was already cut. So to recap where we are, the foundational source for armies of slaves built the pyramids is a foreigner, writing 2 millennia after the fact, who exaggerated the labor force tenfold and was relaying priestly legend. And every storyteller who came after just made the snowball bigger. That's not a smoking gun. That's the discovery that there was never a gun in the room at all. But, and this matters, debunking a bad source is not the same as proving what really happened. Knocking down Herodotus tells us the old story is shaky. It doesn't tell us the true one. For that, we need to leave the library and go to a graveyard. In 1990, a tourist was riding a horse near the Giza plateau when her animal stumbled. It had tripped over a low mud brick wall, half buried in the sand. Somebody decided to look closer. That wall turned out to be the edge of a tomb, and not a pharaoh's tomb. It belonged to the workers, a whole cemetery of them, right there in the shadow of the monuments they had built. Let me introduce you to 2 of them. I'm going to give them names, but everything about their lives here comes straight from what the dig sites actually tell us. Call the first one Kawab. Kawab is a stonemason, one of the permanent full-time crew, the skilled men who lived and worked at Giza year-round. And Kawab belongs to a gang. Now here's a detail no slave driver on Earth would ever permit. His gang has a name they chose for themselves. We know this because the crews scratched their team names into the stone, and they survive. One gang called itself the Friends of Khufu. Another crew, working under the pharaoh Menkaure, called themselves, and I promise I'm not making this up, the Drunkards of Menkaure. Sit with that for a moment. The men hauling multi-ton blocks up a ramp in the desert had the morale, and frankly the cheek, to nickname their work crew after getting hammered. These are not the names of broken, terrified slaves. This is locker room banter. This is the energy of a rugby club or an army regiment. Men who took real pride in the job and a bit of competitive swagger toward the gang next door. Now meet Kawab's seasonal counterpart, a farmer we'll call Nefer. Nefer doesn't live at Giza. He has a village, a plot of land, a family. But for a chunk of every year, the Nile floods his fields, a season the Egyptians called Akhet, and farming becomes flat out impossible. The land is underwater, there is nothing to do, and that is exactly when the state calls men like Nefer into work and pays them back in grain, in beer, in cloth. So Nefer travels to Giza, he joins a gang, he hauls stone alongside Kawab, he grumbles, he sweats, he gets stronger, he eats better than he does at home. And when the flood recedes, he goes back to his fields. He is not chattel. He is a man doing a tour of duty. And here's a number to chew on, because the logistics behind feeding these men is its own quiet miracle. To keep the workforce fed, the surrounding farms sent a relentless river of food to the plateau. By one estimate from the excavations, something like 21 head of cattle and 23 sheep were driven into Giza every single day. And the archaeologists who studied the animal bones put it plainly: the state supplied enough cattle, sheep, and goat to feed thousands of people prime cuts of meat for more than a generation, even if they ate meat every day. In a part of the world where ordinary people saved meat for festival days, that is staggering. Even better, the farmers who supplied all this were, in return, exempted from paying taxes. Read that again. Supplying the pyramid project got you a tax break. That is not how anyone has ever run a slave camp. That is how you run a national infrastructure program. And the men ate on a schedule we'd recognize too. The records suggest they worked in a rhythm of roughly 9 days on, 1 day off, each on a day of rest every 10th day. Not generous by modern standards. But slaves do not get a structured weekend. Slaves do not get rostered days off. The very existence of a calendar with rest days built into it tells you these were workers with rights, however limited, not property being worked to death. Both of these men break bones doing this. They wreck their spines hauling stone for years. But when they get hurt, something happens that quietly detonates the entire slavery myth. And it's written into their skeletons. So let me put you in Nefer's body for the worst afternoon of his year. For the next minute, you're Nefer. It's the flood season. Your fields are underwater, which is the only reason you're here, and you've made your peace with that. You wake before dawn in a barracks south of the pyramids, in a sprawling, purpose-built work town. Bakeries, breweries, storerooms, dormitories, the whole apparatus of feeding thousands of men. The smell hits you first. Thousands of loaves baking at once. The thick, yeasty reek of beer fermenting in enormous vats. And underneath it, the iron tang of the slaughter yard, because somewhere nearby, animals are being butchered. Cattle, sheep, goats, to feed the workforce. You are going to eat meat today. Actual beef. Sit with how strange that is. That is not a slave's diet. Nobody wastes prime cattle on people they consider disposable. That is the diet of a man the state has decided is worth keeping strong. You spend the day with your gang, dragging a wooden sledge loaded with limestone, chanting to keep the rhythm. Your shoulders are on fire. Your lower back is being slowly compressed, vertebra by vertebra, by years of exactly this. The sun is a hammer. The dust is in your teeth, in your eyes, in the creases of your hands. And here's the thing you'd feel that the myth never lets you feel. You're not alone and you're not silent. Around you, men are shouting, joking, competing. Your gang is racing the gang on the next ramp, because that's the kind of thing men do. And the overseers know it, and they let it run because a bit of rivalry moves more stone than fear ever could. You have a name for your crew. You have inside jokes. You have a rank, a role, a place in the chain. This isn't a death camp. It's closer to the worst, hottest, most exhausting team job you can imagine. A place where you are worked extremely hard and also, unmistakably, counted as a person. And then, one bad afternoon, a block shifts on the sledge, the rope bites, and your forearm snaps. You hear it before you feel it. Here is where the myth dies completely. You are not dragged off and left in the sand to die. You are treated. We know this because we have your skeleton and the skeletons of hundreds of workers like you, and they show healed fractures, broken bones that were carefully set and allowed to mend. Some skeletons even show successful amputations that healed over, meaning the patient survived the operation and lived for years afterward. Somebody splinted your arm, somebody fed you while you couldn't work, somebody decided you were worth saving. You will limp, you will carry that arm a little crooked for the rest of your life. But you will live, and you will go home to your village when the water goes down. And that's the thing the bones scream at us across 45 centuries. A society does not perform surgery on people it considers garbage. You set a slave's broken arm only if that arm has a value you fully intend to keep. The medical care isn't a footnote, it's the verdict. All right, let's slow down. and bring in the document that turns all of this from a strong argument into a closed case. Because the real bombshell here isn't a skeleton or a tomb, it's a piece of paper. In 2013, a French archaeologist named Pierre Tallet was excavating a remote, windblown harbor on the Red Sea coast called Wadi al-Jarf, wedged in front of a set of man-made caves, the kind the Egyptians used to store boats. His team found rolls of papyrus, tied with string, jammed between two large rocks. They turned out to be the oldest surviving papyri ever found in Egypt, and one of them is a personal work diary. It belonged to a middle-ranking official named Merer. Inspector Merer led a team of about 200 men, and his specific job was transporting limestone blocks from the quarries at Tura, across the river, to the construction site of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And the diary dates to roughly the 27th year of Khufu's reign, which is to say the precise window when the pyramid's outer casing of fine white limestone was being fitted into place. Let that fully land. This is a logbook written by a man who was physically there while it was happening, doing the work. Not a Greek tourist 2,000 years late. The actual foreman filing his actual paperwork on the actual job. If you wanted a primary source, the gold standard, the thing historians dream about, it does not get more primary than the project manager's own diary, recovered from where he left it, dated to the year the casing went on. And what does the diary of the man who built the Great Pyramid record? Drama, whips, suffering? No. It records lists, daily logs, the movement of bread, of beer, of supplies to feed the workers. Shipments in, shipments out. One Egyptologist described these papyri perfectly. They are, he said, like the Excel spreadsheets of the ancient world. Think about what that means. The Great Pyramid was not built by anonymous mass suffering. It was built by logistics, by accountants, by a state machine moving food and labor around with the boring, magnificent, relentless precision of a modern supply chain. The most awe-inspiring object of the ancient world has, at its core, a man worrying about whether the bread delivery turned up on time. And we can reconstruct the management chart too. Tallet's logbooks reveal the work organized into squads of around 40 men, each under an inspector. Above the inspectors sat scribes handling the records, and at the very top of the chain stood the vizier, who in this era was Khufu's own half-brother, running the entire operation as director of royal works. The crews themselves were divided into units the Egyptians named after nautical terms, called philes, the Greek word for tribe. Right, left, prow, stern, a workforce organized like the crew of a ship. So now line up everything the evidence is telling us. All at once. Named gangs with cheeky nicknames, a purpose-built city with bakeries and breweries, a diet with beef in it, skeletons with healed bones and survived surgeries, honored burials right beside the king, a foreman's logbook reading like a spreadsheet, a clear chain of command running up to the royal family. Here's how the archaeologist Zahi Hawass put it, in the cleanest line in this whole story: slaves would not have prepared their tombs for eternity, as kings and queens did. These men were buried in honor, beside their pharaoh, equipped with bread and beer for the afterlife, with their gang names carved nearby. You do not give a slave a tomb fit for eternity. The graveyard itself, the very thing a stumbling horse tripped over, is the closing argument. Case shut. Now, I need to be straight with you, because this is where lazy history goes to die, and where the comments are going to get interesting. I am not telling you that ancient Egypt was some sun-dappled worker's paradise. Slavery absolutely existed in Egypt, it really did. There were prisoners of war, there were debtors, there were bonded laborers, mostly working in households and temples, on private estates, and later in far greater numbers after military conquests. Egypt was a deeply unequal, hierarchical society built on coerced labor of various kinds. The point of this video is not that Egypt was kind. The point is much narrower and much sharper than that. The one specific story you were sold, whipped slaves dragging stone to build the Giza pyramids, is the piece that turns out to be false. So what actually built the Great Pyramid? Something we would recognize uncomfortably well. It was corvée labor, a system where free citizens owed the state a chunk of their labor, not their whole lives, just a portion. The way you owe the state a chunk of your income every single year. Nefer wasn't a slave. Nefer was a taxpayer. He paid his taxes in muscle instead of money during the exact months when his fields were underwater and he couldn't have earned a living anyway. And that reframe is the part genuinely worth arguing about. Because notice why the slavery myth is so comfortable to believe. If the pyramids required slaves, then they're a monument to somebody else's cruelty. Safely sealed away in a wicked ancient past. We get to feel superior. We get to shake our heads at how barbaric they were. But once you see corvée, labor for what it is, the comfortable distance collapses. Because we still do versions of this. We still pour collective effort, our taxes, our working years, sometimes our literal bodies, into vast projects we'll never personally benefit from. Cathedrals that took 300 years and outlived everyone who laid a stone. Highway systems, space programs. We tell ourselves it's for the nation, for God, for the future, for the team. Strip away the pharaoh, and the psychology of the pyramid is the psychology of every enormous human undertaking. Since a state that can organize, feed, and motivate huge numbers of ordinary people to build something none of them needed individually. That's not ancient. That's Tuesday. The harder truth is the opposite. The most staggering structure of the ancient world was raised by free people, organized, fed, paid, housed, and patched back together by a functioning state. People who were proud enough of the work to carve their crew's drinking club nickname into the stone, which leaves us with a genuinely unsettling question, and I want you to actually answer it down in the comments. Which is more disturbing, that human beings can be forced to build wonders against their will, or that we will line up and build them willingly for a god king, for beer and bread, and one day off every 10 days, and carve our names in with a smile. Because if it's the second one, then the pyramids aren't really a story about ancient Egypt at all. They're a story about us. So the next time you see that image, the whip, the bent backs, the dying men in the sand, you'll know it for what it is. It's set dressing borrowed from a Hollywood epic, not from the desert. It's Cecil B. DeMille, not Inspector Marer. The real builders left us better than a legend. They left us their diaries, their dinner bills, their team names, their mended bones, and their honored graves. In their own way, across 4,500 years of silence, they were asking to be remembered. And for most of that time, we remembered the wrong thing about them entirely. Maybe the kindest thing we can do now, the small, quiet act of justice available to us, is simply to get their story right. They weren't slaves. They were Kawab and Nefer, the friends of Khufu, and the Drunkards of Menkaure, and they built the most famous thing humans have ever made. Thanks for spending this time digging in the sand with me. There is so much more buried out there, and the truth almost always turns out to be better than the myth. I'll see you in the next one.